Hello and welcome to Economic Summit Conversations. This is a podcast in which we talk about Africa, the continent of Africa. For many, many years, many have been involved in engaging with those on the continent of Africa. A lot of money has been spent with regards to effectiveness. Some things worked well, some things didn't. What we are looking to do in these podcasts is actually to speak with practitioners in Africa and from Africa so that we can discover what are the keys to effective engagement in Africa. It's not a simple thing, but it is something that needs to happen. And so today it is my great pleasure to have as my guest Mr. Boshoff Grobler, and Boshoff is a former investment banker, and he is currently a board member of the anti-corruption organization, Unashamedly Ethical. Unashamedly Ethical, many of us know, it was started by a good friend of both Boshoff and myself, Graham Power, and Graham is now with the Lord, but it started off in South Africa and it has now grown to be a global movement. Boshoff is also a social activist, a social reformer in South Africa, and so Boshoff, welcome. It's good to have you.
It is an absolute privilege.
Yeah, and Boshoff, you grew up in, at least your youth was spent in South Africa under apartheid. Tell us about that. What was that like for you?
Growing up in South Africa in apartheid as a very young boy was as if I lived in a little bubble, because for a very long period of time I didn't even realize what was going on around me. And those bubble experiences then get burst for young 8-year-old boys in South Africa and for, big multinational CEOs globally. At some point in our lives, the bubble gets burst. And for me, that happened when my father, for some other reason, I don't know why, he took me to his business, which was a second-hand car dealership business that was sort of at the stitching of a very poor white community and a very vibrant black community. And his garage was at that point. And he took me to the business one day, and I'm driving there, and I said to him, it was the middle of the night, and I said, "Dad, what's going on? Why are we going there?" And he said that there was a alleged thief that was trying to steal one of the cars, and that the night watchman caught him, and we were now going to go there and try to see what was going on. And as I walked in, there were 2 police officers, my father, who just loves people and cares about the world around him, the night watchman, and the alleged thief. And as I walked in, the night watchman had a cane in his hands, and he just started whipping and whipping and whipping this alleged thief that was crouched in a corner. And I mean, for an 8-year-old boy, it just broke my mind, what was happening. And what probably broke my mind most was that my father, who I love and adore, who's also with the Lord at the moment, he didn't do anything. The police officers didn't do anything. My dad didn't do anything, and I left the scene just thinking, okay, so why? Why did the people standing around not do anything about the beating that was going on? So that burst my bubble, and then at a very young age, my eyes opened to the inequality that we had in the country.
Wow. This provided a real defining moment for you. What did that do? What did that do to you, for example, in your teenage years, Boshoff, or early adulthood?
Well, what it did was I took on this responsibility to be part of the solution in our country. And I had a few defining moments in that. So for a teenager to say, I want to be part of the solution, sounds very grandiose. But somehow there were just events in my life that accelerated that heart for change. And that was the one day Nelson Mandela, that wasn't president yet at that point in time, he came to our church. And I remember sitting there as a young man and just looking up to this person that in our country had been vilified as an arsonist and as a terrorist and so on. And I heard him speak about having a heart for each other in our country. And this black man was standing in this white church talking about love. And it broke my mind that everything that I had heard up until that point in time was clouded, and I had the opportunity there to hear him speak, and I rushed up to him with bodyguards around him, and I forced myself in, and I shook his hand, and I just said, I'm so thankful for meeting him.
Wow. You know what? Yeah, Nelson Mandela, really, really a great man. He's inspired you. I'm sure he inspired many. And so when, as we look now at the majority world and the minority world, and for those who are looking at this podcast, essentially, when I say the minority world, I mean the West, I mean the Northern Hemisphere. We really are the minority right now. And so Boshoff, help us. What can those of us who want to engage effectively with Africa do? What can those of us from the minority world do to increase the effectiveness of our engagement in Africa?
So that's a big question. So I will respond to that question with a riddle.
Okay.
So it's a very well-known riddle, so it's not a big thing. So the question would be, why did the chicken cross the road? And the answer, as we all know, was to get to the other side.
Yeah.
So is the majority world what it needs from the minority world? It's not difficult. It's probably less difficult than what we might perceive. But
Okay.
what it does require, in my opinion, is it needs a change of heart condition in the minority world. And I'll just reference three, in my humble opinion, that things that we need to consider as a minority world. It is redeeming our definition of risk, and hence redeeming our risk appetite. If you're going to go into Africa and you're going to help Africa cross the road in order for her to get to the other side, we need to think about very carefully what risk means and risk appetite means in the majority world. The second thing is we need to think very clearly about our definition of equality, because there are many theoretical definitions and so on, but what is the practical definition of equality that we would want to work towards? What is the equality that sits on the other side of the road that we want to help Africa towards? And then the last one, I think, is a redeemed implementation of entrepreneurship. So if you take risk appetite and you take equality, it happens onto a different version of entrepreneurship than what I think we've seen in the world today.
All right, let's break that down a bit, Boshoff. A redeemed view or a redeemed risk appetite. It's interesting. I'm busy reading a book called The Prosperity Paradox. And one of the things that they're talking about is for those who invest in Africa, for example, that the stakes are different. The starting point is different, especially if you're going to look at innovative, job-creating enterprises, because often the infrastructure isn't there or is inadequate. And one of the examples is Mo Ibrahim, the CEO of Celtel. He decided that he wanted to create the world's first mobile telephone network in Africa in a time when there was no mobile telephone network in Africa, and also many Africans didn't own mobile phones. And now he's shown, it can be done, and it's very successful. And Africa actually, I think, has more mobile telephones than many continents put together, certainly more than my continent of Europe. And so when you say a redeemed risk appetite, now it talks about Mo and others like him, it's just having to go to those who, for funding, etc., they had to go to those who were willing to accept a higher level of risk. Is that what you mean, Boshoff, or do you mean something different?
I mean that, and I'll just take it down maybe one notch, is I had the opportunity to travel to Egypt for the first time in the past week. And so I live in the tip of Africa, being South Africa, and I went into Egypt. And I felt right at home for some other reason, and I couldn't understand why. And then I realized that the very first step that I took into Egypt, I came out of the airport and I had to cross the road crossing, the zebra crossing, to get to where the Uber was waiting for me. And it felt like home because the moment that I put my foot on the road crossing, all of a sudden I went invisible. And everybody that was driving past me put their foot on the accelerator and was trying to knock me over. So when you live in Europe and when you cross a road at the road crossing, everybody stops around you. So it's as simple as the way that an African thing crossing a road has got risk to it. And it's that mindset that when the minority world comes into Africa, to get your Uber, you might lose your life. Okay, so that is very disconcerting. And now to do business in Africa. So we run a business, and I always say it feels like the Iron Man of business to do business in Africa. Because, for example, it's a hospitality spot where we do a lot of conferencing, a lot of coaching, and we do a lot of ministry there as well. Now, our power utility in South Africa have what's called rolling blackouts. So many times we struggle not having electricity. Now we have to do something about getting electricity, and we need to get it from sources. So we now making the investment. It's a risk decision to put more money into an hospitality unit. And we now need to invest money into our solar power grid. But it's not as easy as just investing in solar power, because solar power is something that gets stolen. So now you have to speak to the insurance company to see whether they will insure your solar power while you are in construction. Now, before you can do anything about how to construct it, you now have to put security guards and cameras up to make sure that they are under the watchful eye of people that will look after your solar panels. And you can only have your cameras to watch over your solar panels if you have data and if you have Wi-Fi that can help you to stream those views to the places that it needs to be. And you don't have Wi-Fi if you don't have electricity. So it's this crazy circle of looking at making another investment in a business. And it's not a simple investment. There are adjacencies to that investment decision that one might not think of. And the moment that adjacencies dawn on you, many times non-Africans would step away from the investment decision as opposed to trying to understand it, try to see how you can mitigate the risk and move irrespective the risk.
Okay, that's what you mean. That's really, really clear, Boshoff, and very, very valuable for those of us, who are watching and listening to you from the minority world. I loved when you talked about redeeming, our concept of equality, that you said, it's not about equality of outcome, but of dignity. And so...
That is so close to my heart, and I get emotional when I think about the theoretical way that we talk about equality. But the fact is that equality has got a human face to it. And we had a lady in our church, young-ish, she was 72 years old, and she didn't have private healthcare. And she would sit in our pews at the church and riddled with cancer. but having to rely on a very inefficient social or public healthcare system. And in the end, something that she was able to be cured from, she passed away from, because of the inequality that we have in our medical system, in our healthcare system. So inequality for me has got a face to it. Inequality has got a loving person that sits in our pews and that could have been healed, and she didn't have the opportunity to be healed. So when people say to me, when you're asking us to lean into equality, is it equality of income? Is it equality of opportunity? I get angry is a big word. I get frustrated because I know that inequality has got a human face to it. And I know people, and I live with people, and I am one of those people that have the right to dignity just as anybody else.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter where I'm born, what I'm born from, what I'm born into. And that's what I think when the world comes to Africa, to leave the theory by the airport and to bring the heart that we have for people. And when it's a heart condition. It's a heart condition of saying, I care for people. I don't care where they live. I don't care how they live. But is there something that I can do to restore the dignity that the system that the world is in at the moment has taken away from them?
Yeah, I need to think as I hear you speak, Boshoff, one of our prime objectives as Christians, believers in Jesus Christ, and I would say and expand that to people of all faiths and none then, is to actually relieve human suffering, equality of dignity. And the Bible calls that righteousness and justice.
Yes, I agree wholeheartedly.
And that's close to the heart of God, absolutely, and that's why we do what we do. Now, Boshoff, as we move further into this, you have discovered something, and it's called building a new middle. And so can you explain that? It's a strategy that is relatively new, but it's building a new middle. Can you talk to us about that?
So you very quickly moved me from an emotion of frustration to excitement. So I'm very excited about what we happened upon in some of the studies that we've done. So from a very young age, from the age where I shared the story about the night watchman, meeting Nelson Mandela, having the opportunity to vote in our first democratic elections. The first time that I was able to vote was in those elections. I tried to figure out how on earth it is possible that we know what the dire consequences of inequality are, but we don't do anything about it. And it's true for South Africa, it's true for Africa, it's true for the rest of the world. We know what the impact is of inequality, and yet inequality just continues unabated. So I tried to understand it, and I studied law, and I studied economics, and I worked in banking and investment management, and I couldn't figure it out. And then I had the opportunity to do a study, but from a psychological perspective. So I was able to ask this question from a system psychodynamic or a psychoanalysis perspective. Why does it just continue? And the study showed that in South Africa, and I would suggest that it's probably true for other parts of the world as well, when we look at each other across an unequal divide, we look at each other, if you just take everything else away, but at a subconscious level, we look at each other only in two ways. So you look at me and you say, Boshoff, you are enriched. So you got what I had without working for it. So you're enriched at my expense. And I might look at you and Arleen, and I would say, okay, but you are entitled. You want now what I have without working for it. And from that perspective, if the deep psychoanalysis says the way that we look at each other is as entitled and as enriched. Okay, those two definitions are very far from each other. Those two worlds are so far from each other. And maybe the reason why it just continues unabated is because those two worlds are just too far from each other. That all these initiatives, whether it's a political initiative or a social justice initiative or an economic initiative, that those initiatives are trying to cross a divide that cannot be crossed. Okay, so that was horrible, getting to that point and say, well, maybe these divides are just so far apart and it can't be crossed. But then with some of the people that I interviewed, I happened upon a species of person that tried and failed to cross these divides, but they didn't stop. A redeemed risk appetite and redeemed understanding of equality, that pushed them to take a step and to take a redeemed view of entrepreneurship. And what they did was they built stuff in the middle of these tools, recognizing that it's difficult to bring these tools together. What they did was they built businesses and ministries and political parties in the middle of these two worlds, not trying to get the one to the other, but bringing these two worlds together productively in a central point towards a productive outcome, towards justice, towards, making money. And people would migrate from these two worlds into this productive space and then migrate back and then convene again in this productive space and then go back to their daily grinds. And more and more, I realized that those initiatives are successful. Those initiatives are sustainable. So I can share a quick example of this.
Please.
I really.
Before you go on to your example, for those listening to the podcast, essentially what Boshoff is talking about, sometimes a divide is too great. And to talk about meeting each other in the middle, even that is a step too far. And so building, or at least establishing steps to help people to move closer to each other. Boshoff, what's your concrete example of that?
So a friend of mine grew up in a very poor mining community in South Africa. And he said, I need to get out of here. And he went and studied quantity surveying. So Newton did very well in quantity surveying, but a redeemed risk appetite and a redeemed sense of what equality is sent him back to his community. And he said, I need to do something to restore the dignity of this community. And he started making money, and he worked in the mine as a quantity surveyor. And as he was working in the mine, he realized that the world between the mine bosses and the community were just so far apart. He was trying to get them to work together to the upliftment of the community, and it would just fall apart. And he realized that there was something else needed. And he approached the mine bosses and he asked them how much of their procurement on an annual basis actually happened, not even in the community, but in the province of that mine. And they said, no, about nothing. Most of our procurement happens in another parts of the country even. And Newton asked them, why? Why is that so? And they just said, because this community and this province is just dead. There's no way that they'd be able to provide into our large procurement requirements. And Newton challenged them and he said to them, so what if I can bring small, micro and businesses together to provide services into your procurement programs? And the bosses said it would never happen, never happen. Newton then got sponsorship, built an incubator in the community, raised leaders and business people in the community, started small little businesses that allowed them to now tender for the procurement programs of the mine. On the mine side, what they had to do is they had to unbundle the procurement processes because those were very large numbers of money, which they had to make smaller tenders available. So it's more administration on their side, but they were willing to do it. And now, 7 years later, the majority of the procurement not only happens in that province, but in that community.
Ah.
So two worlds that just collided and couldn't get together came together productively to the benefit of both, and something shifted, something changed. And
Huge.
that's absolutely exciting for me.
That's tremendous. Now, I know, Boshoff, what's ahead for you on this? Because as you look at this, you've done studies on this. This is exciting. It really, really is exciting. You can feel the potential on it. What are your thoughts about the way forward for you in the future with regards to this approach?
Yeah. So I am just so clear in my mind that there's something valuable in this approach that after 25 years of high finance, having worked in Wall Street and in the city and so on, I decided to resign from those positions and have more time available to build institutions and ministries and businesses in the middle. So what it's going to take is people stepping into a new paradigm with new energy and a new mindset, and to do things differently. So me and my family just took that to heart in a massive way, and we said, okay, so if there's like 2% of truth in this proposition, we need more time to do it. So I stepped out of high finance, and I'm now building businesses and advising businesses towards building a new middle in South Africa and Africa. So it's very real for us. There's a lot of risk to it, but we're up for the risk, because if we don't take that risk, the dignity of many will not be restored.
And we end with where we started. It's also about restoring human dignity. And that's what it is. Boshoff, I just want to thank you very, very, very much for taking the time to do this interview. Now, Boshoff is one of the authors that will contribute to the book that we will publish as Economic Summit in the end of March, beginning of the second quarter of this year, called A European-Africa Collaboration, a guidebook to effective engagement between Europe and Africa, actually between the West and Africa. As I mentioned in the beginning, there are many of you who are watching, I know, who have a heart to help, but in the past our helping has done sometimes more harm than good, even though we intended for it to do good. And so that's why this series, Boshoff, this has been a tremendously valuable addition to this series. Thank you, Boshoff. And for those of you watching, thank you for watching, and we look forward to having you join us again on the next episode of the Economic Summit Conversations podcast.